no further ado, Professor Deborah Stipek.
I just wanted to say hello to everybody. How delighted I am to see folks, many of whom I know and have worked with over the years. Just a couple of introductory comments. One is, Marjorie said to me, leaned over as we had just walked in, she said, there's a lot of people here who know a lot of stuff. And so we really see this as a conversation among a group of people who have varying but deep engagement in the field of early childhood education. So we're probably not going to tell you very much that you don't already know. So the idea is to kind of outline some of the major findings, but I expect to see a lot of head nodding because I think you're going to say, yeah, I knew that. That's really important to point out. So we're going to be relatively brief. We really want to be able to get into a conversation very, very quickly after we've given some of the highlights. So this is more food for thought and ways to get the conversation going. The other thing I want to say is that Marjorie and Beth were not officially authors of the Getting Down to Facts Early Childhood report. Unofficially, I don't know if I could have done it without them and Learning Policy Institute. As you will see if you read the technical reports, I cited them shamelessly. They were extremely helpful as I was working on this and with my colleagues, and they reviewed all of the chapters. So they are unofficially have been deeply involved. The other reason they're here is I just didn't want to be in this room with all these people by myself. And so they're here for moral support as well. So thank you both.
Great. Thanks so much. It's nice to see everyone here this morning. As Deborah said, we realize that most of you in the room know the ECE system in California inside out, but I know there are some people who don't. So I'm going to briefly describe the ECE landscape in California. Here's the one-liner. California has a range of programs to support our children birth to age 5, but the programs are insufficient in scope and terribly uncoordinated. Hold on. There we go. There are over 3 million children birth to age 5 in California, more than any other state. And it's a very diverse population, over 50% Latino, nearly half from immigrant families, a third who are dual language learners. And there's a very high poverty rate, right? About 20% of 0 to 5-year-olds live in poverty. Which in 2017 meant that a family of 4 was making less than $25,000. Can you imagine? And another significant group of children living near poverty, defined as 200% of the poverty line. So that's a considerable number of kids. This slide here, the title says it all. Our ECE programs do not have the capacity to serve all children who are eligible for services. So this slide, the dark line in the back, shows the percentage of kids who qualify for services based on family income or other qualifying factors. So it's not even the entire population of children, just those who qualify. And then the smaller light blue line is the kids who are actually enrolled in an ECE program. So you can see we've made a pretty good dent for 4-year-olds. But for 3-year-olds, we're serving just about a third of the kids who are eligible for services. And if you look at the babies on the top, we're not doing right by the babies. So one issue is that the ECE system is so complex, it's really difficult to understand. Difficult even for policymakers, certainly for providers and families. So you know that California has a patchwork of programs, right? There's state preschool, there's childcare, there's TK, there's alternative payment programs. And as you can see here, most of the programs are accountable to multiple agencies, which is both confusing and burdensome. So each colored line represents a different program. So the dark blue line, there's actually the farthest left, there's actually 2 dark blue lines, which is the CalWORKs alternative payment programs, where funding and regulations come from 2 different departments in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and then they go through 2 different California departments, so that either the California Department of Education or the Department of Social Services, so depending on how long you've been in CalWORKs, you're getting your services from one of those. Goes from there down to the centers, family child care homes, license exempt providers. It gets even more confusing when you think about the programs that the K through 12 districts that decide to use their LCFF funds or the Title I funds for preschool, and we have a big mess. So from the provider's perspective, think of how difficult it is for them to weave together the different funding sources, each with their different standards and different accountability. And then from the parent's perspective, this complexity can be a nightmare, where they're even just figuring out what programs they qualify for can be quite difficult. But really, there's many factors that contribute to the unmet need for early learning programs. For one, there's an insufficient supply of ECE providers, especially licensed child care providers for infant and toddler care, as we showed earlier. One reason is that the low reimbursement rates actually discourage providers from accepting subsidies. It's really hard for them to keep up with the costs of running their programs. There's a lack of affordable facilities. And then what we found is that there's been a decline in licensed family child care homes, a 9% decrease between 2014 and 2016. And while we know there's a lot of variability within and across county lines, we know all counties have shortages, and rural areas are particularly hard hit. From the parent's perspective, there's the practical challenge of finding the care that meets their needs, because many of the programs are part-time, which is insufficient for working families, and even full-time programs are only 6 hours long, which still doesn't meet the needs of working families. Now, family child care homes tend to offer longer hours, but for those families who needs weekend or evening or overnight care, those slots are really hard to find. And really, let's face it, care is just too expensive in California, which has been identified as one of the 10 least affordable states for infant care. And there are definitely some recognitions we'd rather not have as a state. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recommends that families pay no more than 7% of their income towards child care, but in California, the cost of care for one infant is 20% of the state median income, and in some counties, it's much higher, going up to 30%. So, to summarize the landscape, it's complex, it's insufficient, but is it good? So I'm now going to turn to my colleagues to talk about issues of the workforce and program quality next.
I do want to say that we are purposefully kind of skimming the surface today because we want to get to the conversation. But, and most of this should be familiar to you. If you want to go deeper, there are hundreds of pages that go deeply into the details of the things that we're talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about training and preparation for people who are working in the early childhood field. Training requirements of administrators are actually not that different from other states. They're relatively low, 12 units of ECE for Title Director in a Title 22 funded program, plus 3 administrative units, and 4 years of teaching experience. So teaching experience is obviously more important or considered more important than any kind of formal training. I wanted to mention elementary school principals because increasingly early childhood programs or preschools are being put on elementary campuses, and many districts are having the preschool come under the principal of the elementary school administratively, primarily to create greater connections between pre-K and elementary. I'm going to go into this in more detail this afternoon, but I did want to mention this as far as training goes because the elementary school principals that we have interviewed in some other work that we're doing often complain that the preschool is kind of lands under their wing, but they have no training in early childhood education. Many elementary principals don't even feel real comfortable with kindergarten. And so you add 4-year-olds to that, and they are doubly uncomfortable. And they have said to us, we're supposed to evaluate people doing a kind of education that we really don't understand and don't know very much about. So that is something that I would highly recommend we pay attention to, especially if this movement toward putting preschools under elementary principals' guidance continues. Teachers is where California is really weak compared to other states. Most states, 34 as of 2014, and I suspect quite a few more since then, require a BA plus early childhood coursework for people who are engaged in some facets of early childhood education. It's usually state pre-K. In California, it's much less than that, and hugely variable. So a person who has responsibility for young children in California has anywhere from no requirements whatsoever to a high, at least in state-funded programs, of 24 units plus some experience in early childhood education. There are all kinds of reasons why we're restricted to 24 units, but I don't think anyone believes that a person could be fully prepared to be a preschool teacher with a few courses that are primarily focused on foundational knowledge, not as much on practice, particularly if they're going to 4-year colleges. One of the ironies of the situation in California is that the people who are getting their coursework in early childhood education in community colleges are actually getting a little bit more emphasis on practice and a little bit more opportunity to engage in supervised practice opportunities than they are in the 4-year colleges. Am I screwing up? Oh. Guess I should look at the thing once in a while. All right. So that's a problem that I think the state really needs to work on, and I know that there are some efforts that are ongoing to try to address the need for increased training for teachers. When I get to the workforce issue of how poorly they're paid, we'll understand why we have a real dilemma in the state. We do know from research a fair amount about the qualities of effective teachers. We know that sensitive caregivers promote better learning outcomes for children. We know that the use of complex knowledge is relevant. We know a fair amount from experimental studies what it takes to promote language and literacy and math skills in young children. Unfortunately, the way we assess classrooms in California, and actually in a lot of states across the country, picks up the sensitive caregiving, but does not really assess the academic skill development that we have research that tells us a little bit about what teachers should be doing to promote those. So we can do some work not only in training, but also in monitoring, teaching, and identifying needs for opportunities for professional development for teachers. What we don't know very much about, and you won't be surprised that a researcher will say, we really need to do more research on this topic, because that's what we always say, is what kind of preparation really helps people be good teachers. Most of the research on this has been the BA versus not a BA. And the research has not really provided a very clear answer to that question. My own view is that what we really need to understand better is what is the content and the kinds of experiences that people need to be effective in the classroom from the day they walk in the door. Now, they're not going to be great teachers the day they walk in the door. We know that they continue to need professional development and support, but we really don't know very much about pre-service effective training for teachers. We can learn a little bit from K-12 research on pre-service, although frankly it hasn't been all that clear-cut. The one thing we do know is that practice teaching is really important. It's the one thing that is essentially absent, or at least absent from any of the requirements. I think I'm going to move on to some of the workforce issues, because the training and workforce issues are obviously very much intersect with each other. Many of you are familiar with Transforming the Workplace report that came out a few years ago under the National Institute of Medicine. So what they argue for are 4 kinds of needs that early childhood people have to be able to be effective. Appropriate earnings and economic status, appropriate education and training, clearly delineated career paths, and supportive working conditions. Now, a team of very smart people put this together, but I have to admit that when I first read it, my reaction was, yeah. I think that's true for any area in which you do your work. But I think it's, on the other hand, useful to remind us just how much we are not providing this for our workforce. As you know, we have a significant shortage of people who are going into the field, and we have people who are leaving at a very fast rate. Why do they leave? They leave because they don't feel effective in the classroom. They leave because they don't feel like they're getting the support they need, particularly when they're novices. That the working conditions are challenging. In addition to low pay, which we're going to talk about in a moment, they're not getting the kind of support that even, having spent all this time as a dean, I was used to complaining about how K-12 teachers didn't have enough time for preparation, didn't have enough time for professional development, and so on. Now I'm looking at K-12 teachers and thinking, wow, that's what we aspire to. That's golden. Because in comparison, preschool teachers have very little of that kind of support and opportunity. Obviously, opportunities to earn more pay, especially for people who have families to raise, or people who want to be able to pay rent in some place like the Bay Area, and better career opportunities. And so they're leaving rapidly. And this is a really serious problem that I'm not sure California is prepared to deal with. Pay is, that's the elephant in the room. It is horrendously low. These are the wages for people. I think what's noteworthy about this particular presentation is that someone who is teaching TK 4-year-olds is making twice what a preschool teacher is making teaching 4-year-olds. Same kids. But if you happen to be a lucky 4-year-old who is in a TK program, you have a teacher who had far more years of training, has had a teacher credential, training and practice, supervised practice experiences. If you're a 4-year-old who lands in state pre-K, you have a teacher who has had much less preparation. Now, there are some fantastic preschool teachers, despite the fact that we didn't arm them with all the preparation that they deserve to get. They just get it. But I don't think we can assume that all the time. It turns out that in California, a BA doesn't get you a whole lot. It gets you a little bit, about $4 an hour. Childcare providers without a BA in 2017 earn $12.29 an hour. Let's look at the actual salaries. So these are people who have BAs. And as you can see, that teachers working with children who are birth to age 3 earn a very, very low salary. So these are people who are comparable in education, but have very different incomes. There are differences even within the field. So I've been told that people, I think, especially as somebody, Mike Olnick was telling me in Los Angeles, that people are leaving state pre-K to go teach in Head Start centers. That's probably true in other areas as well, if that option is available. Well, $5,000, that's nothing to sneeze at when you're talking about a base of 28, 30, 33,000. So I'm going to stop there. These data I know people are very familiar with. This is something that I think all of us have been extremely worried about and have advocated for change for a long time. So I don't think there's too much news there, maybe a few details if you delve into Marcy Whitebook's chapter in the Getting Down to Facts report. But we're going to go on now to quality improvement efforts.
And what a perfect segue, right? Because we all know the other elephant in the room is that the huge amount of the quality of the early learning care that kids are going to get is determined by the workforce, not just by their preparation or their support, by how stressed out they are in the environment, whether or not they're worrying about feeding their kids because they're making below poverty wages. So, not surprisingly, I'm going to show you this graphic. This is just requirements for 4-year-olds in the state of California by different programs. Just like with the teacher preparation requirements, you see that the standards really run the gamut in terms of the bar that they set for how high quality the care in theory should be. And so you can see that when you look at staff to child ratios, you can see that some types of care have no requirement at all. Others are as high as 1 to 12 or as low as 1 to 8. And that really matters for young children because they're really learning through relationships, as we know. And so the availability of staff to form relationships with, to engage with on a daily basis makes a difference. And then you can also see that the requirements really vary in terms of whether or not there's a requirement to have a curriculum. Many, although not all of these programs, have other sort of educational standards, things that describe what the educational environment should be like. But these are the standards that, at least theoretically, are easiest to measure. And so those end up being the standards that folks understandably spend their energy worrying about complying with. Because even when you look at curriculum, having a requirement to have a curriculum doesn't mean necessarily that that curriculum is being implemented with fidelity, that teachers in the classroom are well trained on the curriculum, understand how to use it to actually individualize instruction to support kids' development. And those things are incredibly difficult to measure. We as researchers are struggling to do that, and so then taking that from a research lens where you have a relatively small number of programs you're trying to understand and do that on a large scale is very difficult. And so what that ends up creating as well is not just these standards, but really a focus on compliance as it relates to health and safety. So it is the age-old adage, we hear it all the time, teachers complaining about, the only thing they're really looking for is whether or not I'm washing my hands. I don't mean to say that health and safety is not incredibly important. It is. We want for kids to be safe and to be well in the early learning environments that they're in. In fact, it's a precursor to their ability to learn, but it doesn't meet the goal that we're really setting for early education. All right. So when it comes to quality improvement strategies in California, I think most of you know, the state has of late put most of its eggs in the basket of quality rating and improvement systems. But it's not one basket, it's actually 58 baskets, and then maybe you have some grouped baskets around regional hubs. And the reality is they're also not putting enough eggs into that basket, right? I'm gonna really hammer that analogy home, but they're not investing enough in quality rating improvement systems to make them effective. So what we have is incredibly low participation rates in our quality rating improvement systems right now. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's voluntary. Maybe that's the way it should be, since we have lots of issues with our quality rating improvement system right now. But when you have a voluntary system that is also offering incredibly weak incentives for participation, people don't participate. So the most recent data shows that about 29% of licensed childcare and only 7% of family childcare homes were participating in QRIS as of September of last year. So that's nowhere near the number that we need if we actually think that quality rating improvement systems are the way in which to improve quality for early learning in California. When it comes to weak incentives, we also find that because these quality rating improvements systems are so decentralized, it really varies from county to county what kind of incentive you're getting. So are you getting a nominal sort of bump to cover additional training? Are you getting extensive coaching? And who is really eligible, not just to participate, but to get those types of incentives, right? How high quality do you have to be to get the better incentive? And one thing that's starkly missing from our quality rating improvement systems, which I know we're working on, I'm excited that we're working on it as a state, is any kind of acknowledgement that higher quality programs should be getting more money to support the higher quality care that they're providing. So while coaching is an effective strategy for quality improvement, it doesn't necessarily cover the base sort of costs around paying teachers more so that you can have better prepared teachers that actually stay in the classroom. It doesn't cover the costs of monitoring your own classrooms so that you can help teachers improve. You can actually individualize the training and preparation that they're getting. And so it's really just an incredibly underfunded system that would benefit a lot from that tiered reimbursement approach if we want to continue using QRIS as our sort of #1 quality improvement strategy in the state. And apparently 30 other states have tiered reimbursement systems with their QRIS, so this is not a new idea. And then finally, one important, perhaps, element of quality rating improvement systems that is largely lacking in the state right now is the rating piece. Ratings have been slow to come online, which is understandable as we're building a quality rating improvement system and have such low participation rates. But part of the point, one might say, of a quality rating improvement system is to provide families with digestible information about the quality of the care that they have access to so that they can make informed choices about where they want to send their child. And right now, the state of California really is not achieving that. It is achieving it sometimes at the local level, where ratings in some counties are more available, especially for center-based care that has a higher participation rate. But in general, we're not equipping our families with information they need to make those kinds of choices. Okay.
All right. So think of your questions. I've been asked to summarize what I just heard, so I'll do that in 1 minute. Early child education in California is a dizzying array of programs, funding, sources, and regulations. Children attending high-quality programs do better in school and in life. Childcare is prohibitively expensive for many families and does not meet the needs of non-standard work schedules. Just an additional research point, if I can, you talked about medium income, but for a minimum wage family, it would be over 70% for full-time, 70% of their income for full-time infant toddler. California has a large proportion of children in non-licensed care. Wages are so low that nearly 60% of childcare workers rely on some form of public assistance. California has low and uneven teaching training requirements for early childhood education programs. And finally, the process for monitoring quality and improvement is fragmented, inconsistent, and insufficient. So on that uplifting note, we're going to spend some time on Q&A, and then we'll do the table questions. Actually, the presenters thought, given the quality of this group, we might want to spend a little bit more time in Q&A so you have time with the researchers, but we'll see how it goes, and then we'll definitely leave at least a little bit of time for table questions. So lots of folks in this room can fire away with a lot of questions. Go ahead.
getting down to Facts 1 was focused on K-12 education, and it was more narrowly tailored than Getting Down to Facts 2. Getting Down to Facts 1 focused primarily on the finance system, which, as some of you may remember, was a complete and total mess. The fact that we've made so much progress in the finance system in K-12 in 10 years actually is, I think, very encouraging to me, that big changes can happen in a decade. But it did not include pre-K or early childhood at all. And it didn't include the breadth of topics that Getting Down to Facts 2 includes.
And one other thing I'd say, just a historical note, when Getting Down to Facts 1 came out, there was the focus was all on the adequacy number. There was a lot of arguments about how much K-12 needed to equal New York or other states. And I think this rollout was a more helpful, broader rollout. But then, as I mentioned earlier, there was, as I think you saw in the press, a real heavy focus on Deborah's study and the early childhood piece, which was fantastic to have that lead a series of, quote, TK K-12 studies. Come on, this is not a shy group. I'm going to call on you guys by name if you don't ask questions. Oh, Scott, I knew you'd have a question. Yeah.
He probably has the answer, too. Yeah, he has the answer. I think we might both want to speak to this. I know that, Deb wrote the chapter that you're referring to, but I think that it's a really good point. I think that we're struggling right now as a field to think about the best way to measure quality in terms, because we all know that really what quality means is that it's effective and children are learning and they're doing well and they're leaving ready for school. And we're having trouble identifying precisely the mechanism, the thing that we can measure in classrooms that actually gets us there. I think that, with the validation studies with QRIS, I would say that there's variation in terms of, I think that there are quality rating improvement systems in this country that are doing a better job of measuring the things that matter, such that those quality ratings map on to children's child outcomes. But I think that there's also perhaps just, it costs so much. I think we know what it is. I think we know that it's classroom instruction. It's the way that we're managing challenging behaviors and supporting social emotional development. And it's that deep content knowledge. It's instruction that conveys not just topical knowledge, not just surface level, but a deep understanding of the concepts that underlay it around phonological awareness and math and problem solving, competent, I'm not thinking of the right word. But anyway, I think what we're not good at is measuring that, or measuring that in a large scale, and then having that be able to be translated into a rating. But I'm going to let Deb offer her opinion as well.
No, I agree that a lot of the problem has to do with measurement. I know people who are ready to give up on QRIS because of the research that says that it's not correlated across the country, the studies that have been done, with child outcomes. But one, it's difficult to demonstrate any kind of classroom efforts being correlated or predictive of child outcomes. So it's a very high bar from a research perspective. But one of the things that I think is worth pointing out is that there is a disconnect between what we measure in the classroom and what we measure in children. So we do not measure instruction in the classroom. Class, which almost everybody uses in this state and across the country, with due respect, it has 3 items on instruction, and they're they're very superficial in some respects. So I've had many teachers say to me things like, because they're trying to get their class scores up, because that has become, it's hand washing and class scores. Those are the 2 things that people really pay attention to. They are asking open-ended questions. And I say, well, that's great. They've picked that up from the class, but they don't know what to do when a child responds. So, and the class doesn't pick up the reaction. It basically just scores, are they asking open-ended questions? And so we do, and then we measure children's literacy and math skills, which we aren't measuring in the classroom at all. So I'm not surprised that there's not much of a correlation between what we measure in terms of quality and what children's outcomes are in terms of academic skills. That's not to say social emotional isn't important. I think we do measure classroom social emotional environment pretty well.
We don't measure it in children, right?
Pardon me?
But then we don't measure it in children.
But we don't measure it very much in children, and partly because the only way to measure it in children reliably is teacher ratings, and the teacher ratings are the same. I mean, it's a very difficult field. It's not that we're sloughing off or not trying. It's that we've taken on a difficult task. The other thing, and Scott, you and I have had conversations about this, the measure of child outcomes that we're using, the DRDP, is not a reliable measure of specific domains of outcomes. I mean, the data that we looked at was very, very clear. When teachers are using the DRDP to assess children, the correlations among the different, 7 different dimensions, are almost perfect correlations. So we're getting a global assessment. Is this kid making progress compared to other kids? That the DRDP tells us. Does it tell us anything about what this child understands about mathematics or basic number understanding? No, because you can predict their math score better with information on their social emotional development than you can. But I mean, and I think it's not necessarily a problem with the measure itself. I think the measure has very good face validity. The items look totally reasonable and reflect what we think are the important skills. But teachers don't have the training that they need, and they don't have the time because it's sort of added on to all the other responsibilities that they have. To really assess a child's literacy skills or math skills, you need to sit down with the child individually and engage the child in activities and see how they manage to deal with the kinds of problems that you provide. But if you don't have a math curriculum, which most preschools don't have or don't implement one, how are you going to sort of fill out an assessment of their math skills on the basis of kind of hanging out in the classroom and interacting with children generally? I'm going off a little bit on this one because I think it's a really important issue that we need to face, because we're spending a ton of money on measures that may or may not be the most productive measures. Are there better ones out there? For classrooms on scale, yes and no. For child outcomes, absolutely yes. So that was a long answer, and I'm sorry for my little tirade.
Can I make one more point related to the QRIS question? And I think we need research to confirm this. This is just my feeling. I don't think that there are many quality rating improvement systems, if any, in this country that adequately compensate programs for providing higher quality care. And I do think that a big elephant in the room is money. Programs don't have the money to have the staff, to have the time to provide early learning well. And so I think that to the extent a quality rating improvement system actually was a mechanism for providing more money, and an adequate amount of money to programs that are providing higher quality care, we might see something different going on there. Because I think there's this focus on, do they check the boxes on the matrix, and then there's the child outcomes, but it's that, are they checking those boxes well? The question of like curriculum and curriculum implementation, these are disconnected in our field, and I think a big reason is resources.
I'd like to hear from other people. Are there other people here? Because you've had experiences with QRIS and our efforts to improve quality. Anybody have any thoughts to add? Washing is a good thing. I'm not knocking it.
Yeah.
If, yeah, if the BA level teachers actually have instruction and support in instruction, which most don't now.
Camille?
Yeah.
Yeah. we're going to be talking in this afternoon session about the links between the different systems, but one thing that we've found in our research is very in line with what you're saying, and we talk about we need these great links, but there are a lot of folks in the early learning field who's like, whoa, we actually don't want to make those links because of the fear of the pushing down and the developmentally inappropriate practices and the lack of looking at the whole child. So there's a tension in the field between knowing that tighter linkages are actually going to be really good for the kids, but the way we do, but just linking is not right. To pay attention to what we're linking and who's learning from whom, right?
Yeah.
Deborah, you're going to.
Well, I just a couple of comments related to all the many important things that you said. One thing I want to say about the report is that it will come across sounding very critical, but I and everybody who is working on it are well aware, and to some degree we're involved in work that is designed to address the very problems. But we were told to provide the state of the state. And so I want to be clear that this is not in any way critical of all of you in the room, including ourselves who've been working on these things in very productive ways. And that gives me a lot of optimism. I just wanted to say that in our studies of some of the districts where the elementary principals were really getting, like Fresno, they've done a really good job of training elementary school principals, having them visit early childhood programs and that sort of thing. And what the elementary school principals are doing is they're seeing that they need to change their kindergarten and their first grade. So people, when they get wised up, they do understand that it's not just a matter of pushing down kindergarten into preschool. How do we do it? The other thing I want to say is that the kind of really effective supporting of children's learning and I'm just going to focus now for a moment on academic skills, requires an enormous amount of training. It's not that hard to hand kids workbooks and do flashcards. It's not that hard, although there are management issues in both sides, to have children mostly playing. What's really hard is capitalizing on children's interests and engaging them in literacy and math and science and social studies and other kinds of activities that they love doing. I've seen it in a way that is tailored to their skill levels, their interests, that engages them actively, that listens to their understanding and builds on it. It is really, it takes a tremendous amount of skill. So the kind of effective opportunities for learning, I avoid the word teaching and instruction because a lot of preschool teachers don't like those words, but providing opportunities for learning that are really effective is not something that you can expect someone to learn how to do with 24 units of instruction.
And, one other point on this with the linkages to K-12, because the quality measurements in early childhood are tough, but I think what's important for the Berkeley 5 field to know is they're tough in K-12. There's been a lot of money, a lot of time. We still don't know how to do it right. That said, even very imperfect quality measures forced people to say, oh my gosh, look at the equity problems that we have. It wasn't until California established a very, very imperfect K-12 accountability system that people said, oh my gosh, right? And we're working on that today. So I say that as almost a challenge to the field. We can be here 50 years from now coming up with the perfect measurement system, or we can work on trying to get something, because that equity, you have a $30,000, $40,000 childcare preschool for your kid with high quality folks, and guess what? That stuff's probably happening, right? But unless you have a broad-based measurement system, which you're not showing is how many kids are. So I'm just saying that as a challenge, and especially since we're talking about K-12 here too, and K-12 hasn't figured it out, but even imperfect systems have put the focus on lack of equity. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
What have we learned from other states? Because other states, exactly this point, what were some of the first steps that states have been
Okay, I'm gonna at least address your one first, and then maybe we can, as a group, address yours. So you're right. There is a tension there. We are incredibly underfunded as a system, if we want to go that far in California, to use that word. But I think, I heard Deb say this at the water cooler just last week, was it? Or a week, 2 weeks ago? I think we'd really be doing children a disservice to act as though we can't address these at the same time. I think that there's some research to show that really poor quality childcare can hurt kids, right? So we don't want to be providing access to just anything. We don't want to perpetuate inequities by providing access to poor quality for only the kids who are getting subsidized care. We don't want to perpetuate inequalities by offering a high quality program that's only half day, and so that only parents with the motivation and means to deal with the logistics of that have access to it. And so I really think, one caution, we have a crisis in this state for infant and toddler care, that is obvious. But one caution about that, we've gotten kind of far with 4-year-olds, is that does not in any way account for that chart that I showed of the varying quality standards and access to what. And the reality of all of our quality questions is that generally those kids with the lowest income parents, with the least means and or motivation to access care, are getting the poorest quality of those tiers. And so if we have an inequitable system, we can't expect that we're going to have children starting school on equitable ground.
Yes.
So I want Deb to also contribute, but I will just say, and I feel like I'm beating a drum / dead horse here, is that there's something to be said for our reimbursement rate system, and it's just general inadequacy. It's inadequate in terms of providing not enough money so that infant and toddler care providers, in particular, can survive as a provider, right? Because you can serve fewer infants and toddlers even with a higher reimbursement rate for those younger kids. When you're serving fewer kids, it's harder and harder to make ends meet and actually be able to run a program. And then, what was the other piece of the question? Maybe you should go, because I'm losing
Well,
my-
just to bring in the state comparison to the question as well. All states have license exempt care. California has a higher proportion of children in license exempt care than most states. And the other thing to keep in mind is that most of the children who are in license exempt care are low income children. And they are the most reactive or responsive or influenced by the quality of their environments. So there are a few states that have required certain kinds of monitoring and licensing of even license exempt care. Oregon is one where they do at least a site visit, and there's some, it may be not a high bar, but there is a bar. And I would think that California could at least at a minimum have some kind of a monitoring system for care that is subsidized publicly, but not monitored at all, especially given that it is our most fragile and kids who need the quality the most in their caregiving situations. Not that my grandchild doesn't also need quality care, but
Quick poll, either raise your hands if you want to keep doing Q&A or if you want to break up into tables. So if you want to keep doing group Q&A, raise your hand. And if you want to break into tables, raise your hand. Okay, we're going to keep doing group Q&A. Okay. But these questions people spend a lot of time on, so answer those in your heads while you're asking those experts the questions. All right, let's keep this group conversation going then.
I was just going to make one more comment on the license exempt care, is that there are even some really great examples in our own state of folks who are working really hard to try and reach those providers and give them supports, whether that be access to information or play groups where they can also learn about child development and things like that, all the way up to encouraging and supporting those kinds of providers to become licensed providers and increase the supply of care in our state. So I think that those are also places where if we both set a bar for them and then also provide them again with some supports and some resources, then we can get to a better place.
oh, just quickly, we didn't answer Phil's question.
At all.
So what? we usually try to ignore Phil, but this time he's asked a good question. I mean, there are some good examples. There are good examples for different things. But one thing that is common among the states that are doing a good job, where they're getting good child outcomes, is that they have put resources into it. You can't do it without that. And so you look at New Jersey, for example, and they're the states that are also putting more money into K-12, but there are states that have really understood the importance of these early years, and they have put the resources in that direction.
I just think it would be an interesting question about those, newer governors specifically, first voluntary plan. It's not going to get all the dollars.
Yeah.
So that first down payment of $10 and $3 back, where's the first 10, the first 20, the first 30
Oh,
that are going to lead to longitudinally, we now have 100, not like looking and saying, have to lose that. Okay. So that we have that longitudinal thing to say, yes, we do.
I mean, I can say one thing about that. I'm sorry, I'm
No,
interrupting
go.
you. She has some really great ideas that she's going to share with you about states that you can look to, but not to answer exactly that question. But I will say one point is that we don't have a data system in place so that we would even know.
Right.
So you put some money into the system and did what? We literally don't have the data system in place to know what that accomplished for us. And so there's maybe I think there's more to be done with that first $10, but maybe some low-hanging fruit is to at least start some work on creating a data system that could tell us whether or not we're making improvements. Is that what you were going to say? I did not mean to cut you off from that.
You guys behave.
We like moved on 3 steps. I was just talking about I was thinking about even getting the momentum going, because you can have a governor, whoever it may be, come in and say, I want to do this, but the governor alone can't do it. And in states where we've seen great momentum that weren't necessarily driven by a court case like in New Jersey, but we've seen consistently broad-based coalitions, right? So first of all, we know that early childhood is a bipartisan issue. Everyone there are polls. Everyone gets behind it, and we've seen business leaders get behind it who are willing to take. In Michigan, talking to business leaders who are willing to take the long, say, but that's my workforce. In 18 years, that's my workforce. So we need to invest. We've seen the police and law enforcement coalitions get behind early care because there's the research that shows these, we're going to keep the kids out of the prison pipeline. And I think where we've seen massive, states really get behind it, we've seen these big broad-based coalitions come together with the champion, right? So it's not just, there is a governor, there is a legislator, there's someone, but it really is relying not just on the ECE advocates themselves, but even going beyond that.
It also requires the ECE advocates, those of us in the room, to create a little, as much coherence and cohesiveness as we can, so we are not coming at a new administration with 25 different competing things that we think have to be done first. So a lot of the work that we are doing, and I know some of the people in the room are doing, is having conversations and trying to get not to a consensus, but at least to some shared understandings of what the needs are, so that so that we're not competing against each other.
You're a great researcher. You make a great advocate too. Thank you for saying that. Yes, and then we have time for like 2 more. Go ahead.
To your first question, the answer is no. Higher ed is not prepared to provide the kind of training that we're talking about. But that's, anytime you increase training requirements, you've got other domains that you have to invest in and build capacity in. And I think that at least the folks I know in higher ed are eager to build that capacity. Now, I don't know if their higher level administration is, because it'll cost money, but I think we all understand that the capacity needs to be built. The states vary hugely in how they prepare people. I'm just going to focus on preschool for a moment. Most have a credential program. So it's not, they don't call it a permit, they call it a credential, and it's like a teacher credential. And they vary hugely. So some states you can get a credential in early childhood, which is basically age 3 to 8. In other states, it's 0 to 5. In other states, it's all over the place. But there is more emphasis on the practice of teaching. One of the big problems I see in our 4-year colleges is that the programs where people take their courses to get their permit are not in schools of education, and I'm just not touting schools of education, but at least they have a focus on preparing people for practice. Whereas many of the programs in higher ed are in the kind of program that I went to, child development, which is essentially learning the foundations of children's development. So you learn about language development, but not necessarily how to promote language development and so on. Or you learn about social emotional development, but not how to manage a child who's having emotional difficulties. So I think if we do have something that's going to be in 4-year colleges, we're going to have to reconceptualize what that preparation looks like and possibly where it resides.
So one last question, and are we going to put up the poll numbers too? So would you have okay.
Are there states that are offering incentives for families to get out of prison? Because there are the perverse incentives for families, right? Because if it's your aunt, your uncle, or grandma, they're getting additional compensation for their family unit. So it's perverse about that.
question confused me a little bit because I thought you were talking about moving that license exempt provider
No,
into.
I'm talking about getting families away from license exempt care, period.
Yeah.
Because it's part of the child welfare system, right? Families need the money, so the aunt or uncle is a licensed exempt provider, the family gets to keep those dollars. And so that's a first incentive to keep the child licensed exempt versus in center program.
I think I'm not 100% sure that I know the answer to your question. I think that one way that some states have tried to get at this is through tax incentives, either to families or, mostly to families or to businesses. So that's one way to think about getting more money into the hands of families by incentivizing their use of licensed care on top of actually paying for them to get it. I don't know. Do you know anybody else who's really done that?
I don't know if anyone in the,
I mean,
anyone
out
in the
there.
room.
Yeah, that comment also made me, after I took a step back, I think there's really interesting question around parental choice in our early learning system. I think that there's a necessary respect for the idea that parents should be able to choose where their children go, but I think that what's missing is that all of those options aren't necessarily high quality. So we have a huge number of kids who are in license exempt care. We don't know that would still be true, that parents would actually be choosing that care if we were offering them access to high quality other options. I think that some still would, and the issue of how to address a family that is so high poverty that they need to depend on their child care subsidy in order to subsidize their grandmother or aunt's life, that is an issue. But I do think that as we move towards, if we are able to move towards more options being high quality and actually being able to get and afford those options, we would have fewer people choosing license exempt care.
Okay, we could go all day, but we have to wrap up because it's afternoon. So let's do the poll, so at least we follow some orders here. But while you're doing the poll, let's just thank the amazing presenters and the research.